our last video, we covered the pre-purchase phase of buying an airplane. Let's pick it up now with the purchase phase.
So we transition now to the purchase phase. I've identified that specific airplane that I want to buy. What are the steps in doing it? Well, the first thing you're going to do is do a preliminary review to confirm what are the characteristics of that airplane and does it work for you. Ideally, you want to see the airplane so you can inspect it and take a look at it. You, of course, want to be mindful of the fact that what it looks like, you can slap a fresh coat of paint or a fresh interior on an airplane, but it may not be mechanically sound underneath. So that is not the end-all be-all, but taking a look at it can be very helpful. In the world of the internet, the airplane may not be near you, but the owner can send you pictures. And this owner was incredibly helpful. He had a lot of pictures inside and out that really gave me a feel for what the airplane looked like. And he did something else that was really smart. He had videos inside the cockpit of the airplane in flight. So he actually had videos that showed, and he deliberately panned, and he showed the altitude, the true airspeed, the outside air temperature, and then he showed all the engine gauges so I could see the torques, the temperatures, the RPMs, and the fuel flows. And so while those didn't mean too much to me, I was able to send them to some people I knew at one of the service centers, a mechanic who was very knowledgeable and been helpful, as well as some owners, and say, hey, how did these look? Did these look about right for engines of these many hours on them? And that was very helpful. And then he sent me some information on the flight history of the airplane. He sent me a maintenance sheet on it so I could kind of see the maintenance status and where everything was and the specifications. Now, he did not have it, but when I sold the airplane, I had done it, and other people did, which is they'd scanned all of the logs in, and that is a huge pain in the ass to do. But once you've got them backed up electronically, which is why I did it, and I had them available, just in case the house burns down or your logs get lost for some reason. But you can also share them with a prospective buyer. So that, if you get a chance to take a look at the logs, that can be helpful. But he sent me this information. I had not yet seen the airplane. He was out in Green Bay. And the reality was that with everything he sent me, I looked at it and said, if I fly out to Green Bay for the day to take a look at the airplane, what am I going to get different than I'm going to get right now? And I realized that there was no benefit to doing it. I felt comfortable with the airplane. And if there was anything that came up that I would see when I went out there to look at the airplane that gave me a bad feeling, pre-buy would find that as well, and I could walk away from the deal. So I made him an offer with some contingencies on it to buy the airplane. And so how did it work? Well, first of all, there was a deposit, but it was a refundable deposit, and we had clauses in there which protected both of us. So each of us had the opportunity to walk away from the deal. And if I walked away from the deal, but it wasn't for the appropriate contingencies, he kept the deposit. On the other hand, if we just couldn't come to agreement on something, and I'll get into that, I would get my refund back, or I would get the deposit refunded to me. And so the walkaway criteria was pretty important to protect both of us. When you do a pre-buy, you're going to find things on the airplane. That always happens. That's the nature of airplanes. The question is, what's going to make you walk away? Well, first of all, if there are any things that make the airplane not airworthy, unless you're prepared to take the plane as is, in my mind, that's walkaway criteria. And so that was explicitly stated in there, was that if there were any airworthiness items found, they had to be corrected and repaired at the seller's expense prior to closing the deal. Now, there's also things that are not airworthiness items, but can be significant from a comfort perspective or from a financial perspective to repair that may be an issue. And so that's something that you've got to negotiate on. And so what we talked about and what we came up with was that on those items that were not airworthiness items, up to a certain dollar value, the owner would correct them. Above that, it was on me and take it or leave it. But what that allowed is if the non-airworthiness items were not corrected, and they exceeded a certain dollar value, I could walk away or he could walk away. And so that protected us both from getting hit with a really big bill and a surprise. And I've got to say, the seller was a true gentleman. He was incredibly fair to me, and we were really just trying to do what was right by each of us and do it in an ethical, honest manner. And that's kind of how you do these things, I really believe. So then there was a pre-buy inspection, and this is absolutely critical. And I would never buy an airplane without doing a pre-buy inspection, because you want to know what's going to happen. Now, that pre-buy inspection is going to determine, again, are there things that have to be fixed to make the plane airworthy? Are there things that need to be fixed or that have to be fixed soon? For example, an airplane can be airworthy right now, but in 3 months, the oxygen bottle is going to be due for its 5-year hydro, and unless that hydro is done, the plane can't legally fly pressurized because you don't have the backup oxygen system certified anymore. So that's something that is not an airworthiness item now, but it will be coming up, and you've got to make a decision. Are you going to get that taken care of during the pre-buy, or are you going to just take the plane in for maintenance right after? Now, we talked about who's going to pay for the discrepancies, but there's some other things to consider. Where is the pre-buy going to be done? Who's going to pay for the pre-buy inspection? How is the airplane getting to that location? And then what's going to happen then? So that is all negotiable. In general, the buyer pays for the pre-buy, but that's a negotiable item, and it just depends. Now, when you're buying a piston airplane, typically what you do is you have an annual inspection done, because that's a very deep inspection. It also resets your clock, so you're good for another 12 months. Turbines don't work that way. Most of them don't have annual inspections. They've got inspections based on so many hours of use. And so it's done in a different way. But what did I want to get out of the pre-buy? Because that determined what I wanted to have the pre-buy inspection do. Well, first of all, I've already said I wanted to make sure the airplane was airworthy. Number two, I wanted to get a thorough logbook review just to make sure what was the status of the logs and there were no surprises there. Number three, I wanted to make sure it was compliant with all applicable airworthiness directives, so to make sure that there was not something that, again, made it not compliant. And I mentioned those recurring airworthiness inspections or airworthiness directives. When is that next inspection due? Because I don't want to buy the airplane and in 50 hours or in 100 hours, 150 hours, I've got an inspection that's going to cost me $20,000 to do, at least not without knowing that. You might still buy that airplane and it might be a really good deal, but it's going to be reflected in the price, and you're going to adjust on the fact that pretty soon now you've got to incur that bill. And that goes into those upcoming big ticket items. That was the other thing I really wanted to know about. Engine overhauls, engine inspections, hot section inspections are pretty obvious, but you want to confirm when are those next due and what are they going to cost. And there's nothing wrong with buying a high-time airplane which is coming up due for overhaul right now. There's some people who actually think that's a good deal. You get the airplane dirt cheap. You're going to spend a lot of money to do those overhauls immediately, but then you're going to have total time since overhaul 0 time engines, and you're going to know that they're perfect, and you're going to be able to operate them going forward, and often with a warranty associated with that overhaul. So it's a different way of doing it. It's a different financial calculation, but you've got to understand what you're getting into. But all those time phase inspections on the MU-2, there's 100-hour, there's 200-hour, 400-hour, 500-hour. There's things that have to be done every 2 years, every 5 years. There's 1,000-hour inspections and things that happen every 2,500 hours and every 7,500 hours. So where did the plane fit in the entire inspection regime? What inspections were coming up and what were they going to cost? And that's what I was able to get from the pre-buy, was that these inspections were going to be happening within the next 3 years, and these that I could assume would happen within the next 3 years. This is how much they were likely to cost, and then I could estimate that into the pricing of the airplane, and did it make sense? And I was prepared to go back and renegotiate the price if there was something there that was not as represented. Of course, I'd already knew how many hours were on the airplane. I'd done my research, so I had a pretty good feel for what those inspections were, but this was a chance to go back and discuss that. So where did we have the inspection done? Well, as I mentioned, the plane was based at Green Bay, and there's an MU-2 service center right there on the field. It happened that that was the place where the maintenance on the airplane was done. And so there was some question in my mind, because the typical school of thought is that you don't have the person who maintains the airplane do the pre-buy, because if they've missed anything, well, then they're going to miss it in the pre-buy as well. In the case of this purchase, there's only a couple of MU-2 service centers in the United States. I felt very comfortable with them. I'd gotten to know the head of maintenance there very, very well. He'd been incredibly helpful to me, and I trusted him. And as I said, I was not worried about if I got a $100 thing that broke sometimes afterwards or something. I was worried about things that were going to cost thousands of dollars, and I did not want surprises. So I had that pre-buy inspection done at Jet Air. So now we transfer and we figure out the other things associated with the purchase. First of all, if you're financing the airplane, you're going to have an escrow account. But even if you're not, you're probably going to want to have one because you're moving a lot of money around. And just like closing on a house, you're going to need to do a title and record search to make sure that there's no liens on the airplane. You're going to want to have all the registration taken care of because it's got to be registered not only with the FAA, but there's also something called the Cape Town Treaty, which applies to all turbine aircraft, so jets and turboprops, which tracks not just the airplanes, but also registration for the engines by serial number. And that has to be updated whenever a change in ownership takes place. So what I did, just like when you buy a house, is I hired a company to actually perform the closing and act as my agent. So they took care of the title and record search. They took care of the escrow account. They took care of all the paperwork with the FAA and with the Cape Town Treaty. Now, when I contacted them, they asked me some questions, and there's two big questions that they're going to ask you. First of all, are you going to register it as a corporation or an individual? And that's a subject for a whole other video. And the second one is where you're going to register it, because what state you registered in has implications for the taxes you're going to pay and other paperwork that has to be done. And so you've got to think about that. And as I said, there's a lot of debates and a lot of discussions on that, but that's a subject for another video. So then we proceeded to the closing, and we had the aircraft turnover, which we had agreed to as part of the deal. And what we agreed to was that in this case, the owner was going to fly it to where I was going to base the airplane, and we would go for a demonstration flight together. We would test everything to make sure it all worked. Then I would drive him to the airport, and he'd fly back to Green Bay, and I bought him the plane ticket on my dime. So he delivered it for me, but I've got him home. And everything worked perfectly. And then came that happy afternoon where I got back from the airport after dropping him off, and I was the proud owner of November 130 Mike Sierra, my 1979 MU-2 Marquise. And as you can see here on the screen, here's a picture. The family joined me at the hangar later that afternoon, and we were there proud to have our airplane in the hangar and put away. And that gets us into now the final phase, which is post-purchase. The very first thing that you've got to think about is where you're going to base it. What airport are you going to base it at? And are you going to have it in a hangar or a tie-down? There may be waiting lists for hangars. There may be waiting lists for tie-down. You may have no choice on where you're going to base it, but you've got to figure that out, and there's a cost associated with both of those. You've then got to take care of your training. I mentioned you're going to have to get type-specific training generally, but certainly in the MU-2, I had to do my initial training, so I had to get checked out, and I had to figure out how I was going to do that. I had made arrangements with Reese Howell that he was going to send one of his instructors. I would pay for it, buy him a plane ticket to come to Washington. He flew there. I picked him up. We went to Manassas. We hopped in the plane. We flew back to Smyrna, Tennessee. And then the next day I started my initial training. So I'd worked that all out in advance. And the flight there, while it was not part of the formal training syllabus, actually gave me a chance to start learning how to fly the airplane with the instructor in the right seat. So it was incredibly useful. And then we continued from there. Maintenance. Where you're going to have the maintenance done, I mentioned with the MU-2s, you want to have it done by somebody who's a specialist in MU-2. There are a couple of independent mechanics out there who formerly worked at service centers and are very good. And then there's the service centers in the U.S., all of whom are very good. And I use several of them over the years that I owned the airplane. So that, in a nutshell, is the story of how I bought 130 Mike Sierra. How long did it take? Honestly, from the time I got serious about starting with my needs analysis and mission analysis, where I said, okay, I've got the wherewithal, I've got the financials in shape, and I'm going to buy an airplane, from that time until we closed on the airplane took about a year. It took me about 4 or 5 months of the research phase, maybe a little bit longer, and then it was about 6 months of looking for the right airplane. Now, that's not to say that there weren't airplanes on the market already. That's not to say that there weren't ones that were the model I wanted, an MU-2 Marquise, but it had to work for me. The price had to work, the condition of the airplane had to work, how it was equipped had to work, and the reality is that these are not like buying cars where there are hundreds of cars available for sale in your local area at any one time. At any one time, there might only be 4 or 5 airplanes for sale. And if you follow the market at all for a while, you'll see that some of those are staying on there for a very long time because there's something wrong with them. They may have maintenance issues, they may have damage history, there may be something else, the price may be out of whack, but following the market and seeing that for a while and not being in a rush helps you to find the airplane that's good. And more importantly, you'll be ready when you do find that one that meets your needs to jump on it and make an offer quickly. Because if it's a good airplane, it's going to go. I hope you find this useful. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to talking to you in future episodes. From here, have a great one. Stay safe, fly safe, aviate, navigate, and communicate.